I bought a house for $100. I wasn't being clever. I was broke, desperate, and out of options. My name is Rachel Mercer. I'm 34. 2 years ago, I was sleeping on a second-hand mattress in a Columbus studio apartment, eating peanut butter straight from the jar. I'd spent 6 years building an interior design business with my college roommate, Dana Whitfield. Then Dana quietly dissolved our LLC, walked away with our client list, our vendor relationships, and our reputation, and left me with a non-compete clause her lawyer had drafted the week before she pulled the plug. I didn't have the money to fight it, so I didn't. The tax lien auction was something I found at 2 in the morning down a YouTube rabbit hole. Municipalities sell properties when owners stop paying taxes. Some are worth buying, most aren't. But the entry cost could be shockingly low if you were willing to take on something truly unwanted. 414 Denore Street in Mill Haven, a small town 40 minutes outside Columbus, was unwanted in every possible way. 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow, built in 1931, last occupied in 2019 when the owner, a man named Gerald Foss, died without a will and without heirs anyone could locate. The minimum bid was $100. On the morning of the auction, I was the only bidder. The house was a disaster. Rotted porch railing, boarded windows, shoulder-high sumac against the foundation. But the bones were good. The roof line was straight, the chimney intact. I walked every room with a flashlight and a notepad, and by the time I came back outside into the cold October air, I had already decided I would fix it myself, live in it while I worked, sell it when I was done. The first weeks were exactly what I expected. Exhausting and unglamorous. I tore out bathroom tile, found soft subfloor, pulled the kitchen cabinets, found original beadboard in near-perfect condition underneath. I replaced the porch railing, reglazed 2 windows, spent a weekend cleaning a century of debris from the basement. It was in the 3rd week that I noticed something was off. I was working on the dining room wall, the long interior wall running parallel to the hallway, when I tapped it the way I always do, testing for hollow spots. The left side sounded right. The right side sounded right. But there was a section in the middle, roughly 4 feet wide, that sounded different, not hollow, denser, like something deliberate behind it. I told myself it was extra insulation. Old houses are full of quirks. I told myself that for 3 more days. Then I got out my stud finder and watched the readings jump in a pattern that didn't match insulation. It matched solid, even density, broken by a seam approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide, a door-shaped seam. I went and sat in my truck for a long time, looking at the house through the windshield. Then I went back inside, picked up my pry bar, found the seam and opened the wall. The room behind it was small, maybe 8 by 6. It smelled of cedar and something metallic like old coins. A single bare bulb overhead, wired deliberately into the house's electrical system. The floor was concrete, swept clean, and stacked against the far wall in 12 identical black duffel bags was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I didn't count it that night. I sat on the floor with my back against the door frame and stared at the bags until I could breathe normally again. That's when I saw the envelope, plain white, sealed with wax, on a small wooden shelf mounted to the right-hand wall. No name on the outside, no name at all. My hands were shaking when I broke the seal. Inside was a single card, 1 word in neat, careful handwriting. Run. I didn't run. Running requires knowing what you're running from, and I didn't know anything yet. What I had was a room full of money, a word on a card, and a house I had legally purchased for $100. I locked the wall back up as best I could and sat at the kitchen table until the window went from black to gray to the cold flat white of a November morning. The next morning I drove to the Mill Haven Public Library. Not a lawyer's office, not the sheriff, the library, because I wasn't ready to be official about anything yet. I needed information before I acted. Gerald Foss appeared in the local newspaper archive exactly twice. Once in 2003, in a zoning notice connected to a shell company called Foss Land Holdings, and once in 2017 in an obituary for a man named Douglas Crane, described as a longtime Mill Haven resident and former business partner of Gerald Foss. I wrote both names down. I also wrote down the name of the attorney listed in the zoning notice, Martin Hale of Hale and Associates, Grayfield. Then I went home and counted the money. It took most of the day. I was careful and methodical, the way I am careful and methodical about everything when I'm frightened, because precision is the closest thing I know to control. When I finished, the total was $3,100,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I needed a lawyer. Not Martin Hale. He had a prior connection to Foss, and I wasn't going near anyone with a connection to this house until I understood what I was dealing with. I needed someone outside the county. I gave myself 3 days to research before making any official move. The lawyer I found was Patricia Okafor. She practiced out of Westerville, specializing in estate disputes, probate complications, and what her website called property law for non-standard situations. I called her from my truck, parked 2 blocks from the house because I'd started to feel, irrationally, that the walls were listening. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a pause. "Are you safe?" she asked. That was not the question I expected. "I think so." "Don't move the money. Don't tell anyone else. Come see me tomorrow." Patricia listened to the whole story again in her office, taking notes. At the end, she leaned back and looked at me with the expression of someone doing rapid triage. "The legal status of the money was genuinely uncertain," she explained. "As the purchaser of the property through a legitimate tax lien auction, I had a strong argument for ownership of its contents. But if the money had been obtained illegally, that changed things. The government could make a claim. So could victims of whatever activity generated it." Her advice was immediate. File a formal report with the county sheriff's office that same day. Not because I was legally required to, but because a time-stamped official record of the discovery was the single best protection I had. If anyone ever claims you found this money and hid it, you want a paper trail showing you went to the authorities the moment you had a plan. I filed the report that afternoon. The deputy who took my statement made 2 phone calls. Within an hour, I was sitting across from Sheriff Dale Pruitt, a measured man in his mid-50s whose attention felt steady and real. He sent a deputy back to the house with me. They documented the room, photographed the bags, logged serial numbers on a sample of the bills. Then the sheriff said something that stopped the blood in my veins. "We had a report filed on this address back in 2018. He was standing in the little cedar smelling room, looking at the stacked bags. "Someone called in a tip that a large sum of money was being stored here. We followed up, found nothing, closed it out." A pause. "Looks like we missed something." Someone had called in an anonymous tip in 2018, a year before Gerald Foss died. Someone who knew about the money had tried to have it found or confiscated, and it hadn't worked. I was still processing that when, driving home, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know you found it. Don't do anything stupid." I screenshotted it, forwarded it to Patricia, and called the sheriff. The next morning, Patricia called with news. She'd pulled the full chain of title on Foss Land Holdings. The company had been registered in 2001 with 2 members, Gerald Foss and a man named Raymond Crane, the son of Douglas Crane, whose obituary had named Foss as a former business partner. I had my first direct connection, and someone out there already knew I had it. Raymond Crane was 47, a commercial real estate developer based in Grayfield. Patricia's research turned up a civil judgment, a pattern of shell company registrations and dissolutions, and one other name. His attorney was Martin Hale, the same Martin Hale from the 2003 zoning notice, the same one I had instinctively decided not to contact. My instincts had been good. Patricia laid out the working theory over coffee in her conference room. Foss and Douglas Crane had run a business together, generating cash that couldn't be easily deposited. When Crane Sr. died in 2017, Raymond expected to inherit his father's share, but you can't file a lawsuit claiming money you can't legally explain. So he'd called in the anonymous tip in 2018, possibly trying to trigger a police seizure, after which he could make a claim as an interested party. The search found nothing. Foss had sealed the room. Then Foss died in 2019, and Raymond was left waiting, almost certainly waiting to buy the house himself. And then I showed up at the auction. 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered, because Patricia had told me to document every contact. The voice was smooth and deliberate. "Ms. Mercer, my name is Raymond Crane. I think we should talk. That money belonged to my father's business partner. There's a legal agreement, a private agreement, that entitles my family to half. I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine. I'm asking you to be reasonable." "Call my attorney," I said, and hung up. I forwarded the recording to Patricia. Then I sat on the edge of the motel bed. Patricia had advised me to leave the house and let myself shake for exactly 5 minutes. That was the deal I'd made with myself. 5 minutes of fear and then back to work. She was right that he'd escalate. 3 days later, I came back to collect tools and found the rear door standing open. Nothing was taken, but someone had been through my notes and files. They were looking for something. The answer came to me slowly in a diner on Route 9. He needed to know if I had the private agreement, the one he'd mentioned on the phone, if it existed, if I'd found it. It cut both ways. It could support his claim or expose what the business had actually been. I didn't have it, but I now knew to look. I searched the house methodically. Floor vents, electrical plates, drawer liners, the basement. On a Wednesday afternoon, I found it in the attic, folded inside the sleeve of a vinyl record album tucked into a cardboard box against the north wall. The document was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 2001, signed by Gerald Foss and Douglas Crane. It was a partnership agreement. The two men had operated what they called a cash facilitation service, a phrase that in context was clearly a description of money laundering. Businesses in the region had paid them to absorb cash from unreported transactions and reintroduce it into the legitimate economy through a rotation of shell entities. The split was 60% to Foss, 40% to Crane. The critical clause: in the event of either party's death, the arrangement would dissolve and assets would revert to the surviving party, not to heirs. Raymond Crane had no legal claim. His father's share had reverted to Foss when Douglas Crane died in 2017. With Foss's death in 2019, there was no surviving party. The money had gone with the house. I called Patricia. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Rachel, this changes the legal picture substantially, but the prosecutor's office is going to be very interested in this document." "There was a pathway," she said carefully, "where I cooperated fully with the investigation, and in exchange my claim as a good faith purchaser was treated sympathetically. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was real." 2 days later, I sat across from Claire Dunar, assistant district attorney, and gave her everything: the partnership agreement, the photographs, the recording of Raymond Crane's call, the documentation of the break-in, the threatening text. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch. The hearing was in mid-December. By then, the prosecutor's investigation had been running 6 weeks. I sat in the hearing room in a charcoal blazer I'd bought secondhand and pressed carefully the night before, and I was calm. Not performed calm, the actual grounded calm that comes from having done every single thing you could do. Raymond Crane sat across the room with Martin Hale, wearing the expression of a man who has been wrongly accused of something minor and is patiently waiting for the misunderstanding to resolve. Claire Dunar was methodical. She walked the judge through the timeline, introduced the forensic accountant's findings on the serial numbers, and then introduced something I hadn't known was coming. A man named Frank Sobies, 71, a retired restaurant owner from Grayfield, had agreed under a limited immunity deal to describe in detail his participation in the cash facilitation service between 2001 and 2016. He named Douglas Crane as his primary contact. He named Martin Hale as the attorney who had drafted the shell company documents. Martin Hale went very still. Then Dunar said, "Your Honor, a second witness under a separate immunity agreement has provided corroborating testimony and documentation indicating that Raymond Crane was aware of the nature of the cash facilitation service no later than 2014, and that he received a direct distribution from the enterprise in 2015 in the amount of $80,000. The composure on Raymond Crane's face didn't break, but something behind it did. A change in the quality of his stillness, from controlled to frozen. The judge stopped Hale mid-response and directed that the Bar Association's Ethics Committee be notified of the potential conflict of interest arising from his firm's role in creating the entities described in the partnership agreement and his current representation of Raymond Crane in matters related to those same entities. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." Hale sat down. Martin Hale withdrew from Raymond's case within a week, citing conflict of interest. 2 weeks later, the State Bar opened a formal investigation into Hale and Associates. Raymond retained new counsel from Cincinnati and began assessing whether any deal was possible. There was no deal. In March, Raymond Crane pleaded guilty to 1 count of criminal receiving of proceeds from an illegal enterprise, a $200, 0 fine, and 18 months supervised release. He did not go to prison. That part was hard to sit with. But Patricia reminded me that a public conviction for a commercial real estate developer was not nothing. Within 6 months, 3 projects lost financing. 2 partners withdrew from pending deals. By year's end, Crane Development LLC had filed for dissolution. I didn't do that. That was the natural arithmetic of what he had chosen. The civil proceeding on the money was resolved in May. The portion traceable to demonstrably illegal sources, approximately $900,000, was subject to civil forfeiture and transferred to the state. The remaining $2.2 million, which the forensic accountant had been unable to connect to traceable criminal proceeds, was determined to belong to me as the lawful purchaser of the property and its contents, absent any valid claimant. I read that determination 3 times before it felt real. Then I called Patricia from the parking lot and said something completely incoherent, and she laughed. "You earned it," she said. "Every bit of it." I didn't sell the house. That had been the plan from the beginning: fix it, flip it, move on. But somewhere in those months of working on it, through all of it, it had become mine. I had stripped it down to its bones and put it back together, and I knew every inch of it the way you know something you've repaired with your own hands. The small cedar room was gone. I had opened it up into the dining room, gaining 18 inches of floor space that made the whole room feel more generous. I kept the cedar wood from the walls and used it to build a small floating shelf in the kitchen. I find it quietly satisfying every time I look at it. With the settlement money, I established a working fund for the business I was rebuilding. Mercer Design. No partners. No non-compete clause. No one's name on the LLC but mine. Within a year, 4 paying clients. Within 2/12, I paid off my mother's mortgage, something I'd been thinking about for 15 years, she cried. I did too. I thought about Gerald Foss sometimes, standing in that attic with the dust motes moving slowly in the light. An old man who had spent years accumulating money through means he knew would eventually catch up with him. He'd left one word for whoever found his secret. Run. He meant more than he wrote. He meant, don't let greed trap you the way it trapped me. I didn't run. But I also didn't let fear make my decisions. I documented everything. I trusted the right people. I faced it one step at a time. That's the whole lesson, not bravery. Just stubborn, methodical refusal to be pushed around. The maple in the front yard still has most of its leaves this time of year. I watch it from the porch sometimes with a glass of wine in the evening until it gets too cold to stay outside. And then I go in.